When I was around 9 or 10 years old, my dad landed a high-paying job that meant we had to leave the middle of nowhere Pennsylvania and move to Brookmont, Maryland. Saying "had to" isn't really accurate, though. My parents were thrilled about the change. They made the decision so quickly that it felt like a whirlwind. Within about a month, we went from living in a tiny, run-down house in a lower-income area to settling into a huge property in one of Maryland's most upscale suburbs. If you're wondering how I felt about it, the truth is, it didn't bother me much. I was a pretty introverted kid back then, keeping mostly to myself. I didn't have any close friends to leave behind, so it wasn't a tough adjustment for me. Years later, my parents admitted they hoped the move would give me a fresh start, but that wasn't something I thought about at the time. Adjusting was easy, especially considering how much better our situation was. The new house was enormous, and even at that age, I could tell we weren't going to struggle to make ends meet anymore. I won't go into boring details about the interior, but I'll share what's important. I had two older brothers, Sam and Henry, and the backyard quickly became our favorite part of the property. The yard had this big area filled with twisting hedges that were perfect for games like hide-and-seek or tag. But the best part, by far, was the treehouse. It wasn't just any treehouse. It was more like a tree mansion, situated at the far edge of the property, nestled in a dense patch of tall trees. This thing spanned across 6 or 7 trees. It had 3 levels, an actual staircase built into it, and sturdy construction that looked like a professional's work, not your typical DIY project. For a while, my brothers and I played in that treehouse every single day. It was always the highlight of our afternoons. But as time passed, my brothers grew bored with it. They were older and going through that phase where nothing was cool anymore. Eventually, I was the only one still playing up there. I felt pretty abandoned, honestly. No matter how much I begged, they refused to join me again. One day, when I climbed up into the treehouse, I found a folded piece of paper sitting in the corner. I can still remember the exact words written on it. "Hello, I'm the Marshmallow Man. It's nice to meet you. What's your name?" I was ecstatic. I assumed one of my brothers had left the note to play a game with me. There was a stack of paper and some markers in the treehouse that hadn't been there before, so I grabbed a marker and wrote back, leaving my name on the note. I put it where I'd found the first one, excited to keep the game going. That night, I thought about asking my brothers which one of them was the Marshmallow Man, but I decided not to. I was worried that if I said something, they'd stop playing. For the next few days, I rushed home from school and went straight to the treehouse. Each time, there was a new note waiting for me. At first, the notes were playful, the kind of things my brothers might say. I was having a blast. But over time, the notes started to get strange. The Marshmallow Man began asking me personal questions, things that didn't seem like something my brothers would ask. Stuff like, "What's your favorite time of day to play outside?" Or "What do you usually eat for breakfast?" I didn't think much of it at the time, so I answered every question without hesitation. But one note stands out in my memory. It asked, "Which window in the house is your bedroom?" Thinking back on it now makes my stomach churn, but at the time, I still thought it was just a game. Then, one note crossed a line. It said something like, "What do your pajamas smell like?" That was when I'd had enough. I stormed into the house and confronted my brothers, demanding to know which one of them was behind it. They laughed at me, swearing they had nothing to do with the notes. They even made fun of me for still playing make-believe. I was furious and hurt. I was sure one of them was lying, so I decided to catch them in the act. That night, as I lay in bed, I heard a tapping at my window. My heart felt like it was about to burst out of my chest. I've always been scared of the dark, so the tapping made it even worse. I sat frozen in my bed, too scared to move. Eventually, I forced myself to sleep. The next morning, I pulled back the curtains, and what I saw nearly made me scream. Dozens of marshmallows were taped to the outside of my window. I was furious. This had to be my brothers. But instead of saying anything, I pretended not to notice and went about my day. That night, when the tapping started again, I was ready. I jumped out of bed and yanked the curtains open, prepared to catch my brothers. But it wasn't them. On the other side of the glass was a man. An old, filthy man with yellow eyes, patchy hair, and rotting teeth. He smiled at me when he saw I was looking. I screamed louder than I ever had in my life. My parents came running, but by the time they got to my room, the man was gone. The police searched the property and even the surrounding area, but they didn't find anything. My parents told me I couldn't play in the treehouse anymore, and honestly, I didn't want to. I moved out years ago, but my parents still live in that house. Every time I visit, I can't help but take a long look at that treehouse. That memory still haunts me. My curiosity got the better of me, and one evening, I decided to ask Luke about his time in the treehouse. He was sitting at the kitchen table, doodling on some scrap paper, and I casually asked, "So, what do you and Jake talk about up there?" Luke looked up at me, his little brow furrowing as if he were trying to decide whether to share a big secret. After a pause, he said, "We just play games and talk. Jake likes hide and seek." That answer felt innocent enough, but something about the way he said it left me uneasy. "What does Jake look like?" I pressed. Luke's face brightened, and he started to describe Jake in detail. "He's tall, but not too tall. He has brown hair and wears a green shirt, and his voice is kind of funny, like he's trying not to be too loud." Christy, who was washing dishes nearby, chimed in with a laugh. "Sounds like Luke's got himself a very polite imaginary friend." I forced a smile, but I couldn't shake the weird feeling. There was something about Jake that didn't sit right with me, though I couldn't put my finger on it. Over the next few weeks, Luke's attachment to the treehouse grew even stronger. He spent hours up there, sometimes well into the evening. Christy and I started setting stricter limits on his playtime, especially after sunset. Still, I noticed he would get antsy when we told him to come down, as if he didn't want to leave. One night, after Luke had gone to bed, I stepped outside to lock up the shed and glanced at the treehouse. The moonlight cast long shadows across the yard, and I thought I saw movement near the steps. My heart jumped, and I squinted, trying to make out what it was. But when I walked closer, there was nothing there. Just the empty yard and the treehouse, eerily still. I brushed it off as my imagination, but that wasn't the only strange thing that happened. One morning, Christy called me over to Luke's room. She had been tidying up and found a small stack of folded papers under his pillow. Each one had a crude drawing on it. Stick figures of a man and a boy, usually playing together. The man had big eyes and a wide smile, but his proportions were off. His arms and legs were unnaturally long, and the smile stretched across his whole face. "What do you think these are?" Christy asked, holding up one of the papers. "Jake, maybe?" I muttered. Christy frowned. "I thought Jake was just in his imagination." "So did I," I replied, but the unease in my gut was growing. I decided it was time to talk to Luke more seriously. That evening, I asked him if he'd been drawing pictures of Jake. He nodded enthusiastically. "Jake likes when I draw him. He says it makes him feel real." That sent a shiver down my spine. "Look," I said carefully, "Jake's not real, buddy. You know that, right?" Luke's expression turned serious, and he looked down at the table. "He says he's real, Dad. He says he used to live here." That hit me like a brick. Christy and I had never told Luke about the house's previous owners, and as far as I knew, there was no way he could have known anything about them. "Did Jake tell you anything else?" I asked, trying to keep my voice calm. Luke nodded, but didn't elaborate. That night, I couldn't sleep. I kept thinking about what Luke had said, how Jake claimed to have lived here. I wondered if there was some logical explanation. Maybe Luke overheard something. Maybe it was just his imagination working overtime. But deep down, I couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to it than that. Luke got real strange when I asked him about Jake. He said Jake was shy and didn't like being talked about. When I asked why he spent so much time in the treehouse, he just shrugged and said Jake only liked playing there. He didn't like coming inside. That struck me as odd. Weren't imaginary friends supposed to be wherever the kid imagined them? I brushed it off after reading some articles that said kids sometimes assign special places to their pretend friends. It was weird, but not unheard of. Christy wasn't as relaxed about it. She thought Luke was taking the whole imaginary friend thing too far, and honestly, I agreed. But we weren't the kind of parents to hover over our kids. As long as Luke kept his grades up and did his chores, we let him be. Most weekends, he'd run around with the neighborhood kids until the sun dipped low, riding bikes and playing tag. They were good kids, so I didn't worry much. That's why it hit me like a hammer when Luke came home one Saturday with a black eye. I cleaned him up and asked what happened. He just stared at the floor, silent. I told him he wasn't in trouble and that he needed to tell me the truth. After a long pause, he finally looked up and said, "I got into a fight with Jake." I blinked, trying to process that. It took me a second to remember Jake wasn't real. "Don't lie to me, Luke," I said. "That's not funny." But instead of owning up, he burst into tears and bolted to his room. Christy thought he'd gotten into a scuffle with one of the neighborhood kids and didn't want to admit it. I was inclined to agree. She even wanted me to tear down the treehouse right then and there, but I couldn't do it. I'd poured weeks of hard work into building that thing. I promised her I'd talk to Luke instead, but he wouldn't come out of his room for the rest of the day. The next morning, curiosity got the better of me. I climbed up into the treehouse to check it out for myself. What I found stopped me cold. Scattered around were dirty, tattered children's socks and sneakers. None of them were Luke's or his older brother's. We'd donated all of his old shoes years ago. There were food wrappers, plastic bags, and even a couple of dirty plates. But the thing that really creeped me out were the pencil drawings on the walls. There were crude sketches of animals, foxes, bears, deer, but one stood out, a massive spider, drawn with a face that was just a blank oval. It sent a shiver down my spine. I climbed down and confronted Luke. He told me Jake only liked to talk when he had a full stomach, so he'd been bringing him food. The shoes and socks? Those were Jake's too, he said, adding that Jake was pretty forgetful. That was the last straw. I banned Luke from the treehouse entirely. I knew he was lying to me, and I figured he'd been sneaking around the neighborhood, collecting random junk, and making up stories to cover it. Christy was worried about his mental health, and I was too. We started talking about whether we should get a professional involved. But one evening, everything changed. I was looking out the bedroom window when I saw movement near the treehouse. My first thought was that Luke was disobeying me, but as I squinted, I realized it wasn't him. A sickly, frail-looking child was climbing down the steps. He wasn't one of the neighborhood kids either. His clothes were filthy, and he moved like he hadn't eaten in days. I bolted out the back door, yelling for him to stop. The moment the door creaked open, the boy darted into the woods. He was freakishly fast, faster than any kid I'd ever seen. Within seconds, he vanished into the trees. Christy called every parent we knew, but their kids were all accounted for. We contacted the police, who searched the woods for over an hour but came up empty-handed. No missing children had been reported in the area, either. The whole thing was baffling. The police questioned Luke with our permission. What he told them chilled me to the bone. According to Luke, Jake said he was a magic boy who lived in the woods with others like him. Luke told the police that Jake had friends in the woods, animals, he called them. He gave them names like bear, fox, and other strange ones. Every time Jake visited, he would beg Luke to leave his family and join him in the woods with his so-called friends. When Luke refused, Jake would get angry and make bizarre noises. I couldn't understand why Luke never mentioned any of this to me before. There was a part of me that felt deeply responsible, like I'd failed to protect him by letting things get this far. The police conducted a thorough search of the woods, but found nothing. No traces of Jake, no evidence of anyone living out there. After that, we never saw Jake again. Christy, always the superstitious one, had her own theory. She insisted Jake wasn't real, at least not in the traditional sense. I don't believe in paranormal stuff, but the way she described it left me unsettled. Honestly, I don't know which idea is more terrifying. The thought of some supernatural entity targeting my son, or the possibility that someone, some feral kid or woods folk, was lurking out there in the forest behind our house. This all happened just a few weeks ago, so it's still fresh in my mind. I live in a quiet suburb in Delaware, but I'm a sophomore at college out in California. This happened during fall break in October, when I came home for a few days. Coming home is always a mix of emotions for me. I love seeing my parents, but they can be a bit much. They're old-school traditional, which can feel suffocating at times. One thing that drives me nuts is how strict they are about weed. Even though it's been legalized here, they'd absolutely lose it if they found out I smoked. They've never fully adjusted to the idea that I'm an adult now, but I still respect them. As long as I'm under their roof, I play by their rules, or at least make it look that way. Sneaking around has become second nature. Over the years, I've gotten pretty good at it. I've lost count of the times I've snuck out late at night or gotten into trouble they never found out about. Smoking inside is out of the question. My dad has the nose of a bloodhound. Luckily, my old treehouse is still standing in the front yard. My parents built it for me when I was a kid, and while it's a little weathered now, it's held up surprisingly well. Perched high in the trees, it's practically hidden from view, especially from the house. From up there, I can see everything: the yard, the street, even some of the house windows. But no one can see me unless they know exactly where to look. That treehouse was my safe haven as a kid, the place I'd go to escape. Looking back, I spent a lot of time up there, and those memories hit me hard. But anyway, here's what happened. On the Saturday before I was supposed to fly back to school, my parents were out at some banquet or fundraiser. They weren't going to be home for hours, but I didn't know exactly when they'd return. I didn't want to risk getting caught in the backyard, so I grabbed my stash and climbed up into the treehouse. It was chilly that evening, cold enough that I could see my breath hanging in the air. Sitting there, high above the yard, I started to relax. I've always had this theory that cold weather brings out nostalgia, but maybe that's just me. Sitting up in the treehouse that evening, it felt peaceful and quiet, the kind of stillness I'd always enjoyed. There was something about being the only one around, up high where no one could bother me. As I watched the sunset, my mind drifted to school. I was excited to go back and see my friends. By the time I finished my smoke, the sky had gone dark, which meant I had timed everything perfectly. That's when I noticed it. I was scanning the yard, just enjoying the view, when I saw a light turn on inside the house. I froze. I knew I was the only one home. My heart started pounding as I stared at the window, dread washing over me. That primal fear, the kind you feel when you know you're in real danger, took over. My vision tunneled on that light, like it was pulling me in. Before I could process what I was seeing, movement in the backyard snapped me out of it. 3 hooded figures were circling the property, moving quickly but cautiously. My stomach dropped as realization hit me. I watched, paralyzed, as they approached the front steps. Then, a 4th figure appeared at the door and let them in. My chest tightened as I pieced it together. My house was being robbed. I didn't know what to do. Part of me was frozen, unable to believe this was really happening. Another part of me felt like I couldn't look away, like watching would somehow make it stop. One of the figures stayed outside, pacing the yard like a lookout. Somewhere in the back of my mind, instinct must have kicked in. I glanced down and realized my phone was already in my hand. Without thinking, I dialed 911. I whispered into the phone, trying to stay as quiet as possible, and told the operator what was happening before hanging up. As I was putting my phone away, the faint glow from the screen must have caught the lookout's eye. His head snapped up toward the treehouse. I ducked, my heart racing. Not 3 seconds later, I heard him shout, "Hey!" I peeked through the wooden floorboards and saw him walking toward the tree. My stomach twisted. He knew where I was. He reached the base of the tree and started climbing the wooden planks nailed to the trunk. I screamed that the police were on their way, hoping to scare him off, but he didn't stop. His hands gripped the planks like he was determined to get to me. Panic set in. The only thing within reach was my bong. Without thinking, I grabbed it and hurled it down at him as hard as I could. The glass shattered against his head with a loud crack, and he let out a curse before losing his grip and falling to the ground. He wasn't high up, but the fall must have been enough to make him rethink his plan. He scrambled to his feet and bolted back toward the house, yelling at the others inside. A moment later, all 4 of them rushed out the back, disappearing into the shadows where they'd probably come from. I sat there, shaking, my heart pounding like it was about to explode. Not even 3 minutes later, the police arrived. I was so jittery that climbing down from the treehouse felt like a challenge in itself. I was convinced I'd fall. When I finally got down, I tried to explain what happened, but my words were a mess. I told the officers that I hadn't seen a getaway car and didn't get a good look at their faces. My parents pulled into the driveway not long after that. They were shocked but surprisingly understanding, which I was grateful for. The police said the break-in seemed planned, like the robbers knew my parents wouldn't be home that night. What they clearly didn't expect was me being there. Even now, I'm not sure how to feel about it. I try not to dwell on what could have happened if that guy had made it all the way up to the treehouse. The thought sends shivers down my spine. I'm back at school now, but I haven't had a good night's sleep since that night. Every sound in the dark makes me jump, and the fear that those people might come back haunts me. The worst part is worrying about my parents being there alone. I pray that's the last we'll ever hear of those intruders. I don't want to imagine giving an update to this story, but if, God forbid, something happens, I'll let you know. This whole experience stirred up some old memories, particularly one from my childhood home. My family moved there when I was about 4 years old, and we stayed until I was 14. Those 10 years hold some of my best memories, even though we moved out of state when I started high school. A nightmare in its own right, but unrelated to this story. The backyard of that house had a treehouse, built by the previous owner for his kids. My parents said the kid-friendly features of the house, especially the backyard, were big selling points when they bought it. My older brother Kyle and I were thrilled about the treehouse. Kyle's 2 years older than me, so he was 6 when we moved in. 4 years, we played in that treehouse with friends from the neighborhood. But as we grew older, the novelty wore off. By the time I was 12, I'd stopped playing there. Instead, I went through a rebellious phase. I caused trouble at school, threw tantrums at home, and got grounded more times than I could count. One weekend, after a call from my guidance counselor about my grades and behavior, my dad grounded me again. I was furious. In true preteen fashion, I grabbed a couple of blankets and pillows and stormed out to the treehouse, declaring I wouldn't sleep in the house. This wasn't the first time I'd done this, and my parents didn't seem to care anymore. It was my way of rebelling. What my dad didn't know was that I had snuck my Nintendo DS with me. I wasn't allowed to play video games while grounded, but that didn't stop me. I played Animal Crossing for hours before finally getting tired. I must have just fallen asleep when I heard it. A voice, deep and deliberate, calling my name. Tommy, Tommy. At first, I thought I was dreaming. Still groggy, I tried to shake off the confusion. Then the voice came again. Tommy, are you up there? It sounded like my dad, but something about it wasn't right. My heart started pounding. I didn't answer. Then I heard the creak of the ladder as someone started climbing. My stomach dropped. I stared at the opening in the floor, frozen with fear, as a head slowly appeared through it. I couldn't make out the face, just the shadowy outline of a man. "Ah, there you are," he said. My voice cracked as I whispered, "Dad?" But he didn't respond. For about 20 seconds, I just stood there, frozen, staring at the shadowy head poking through the treehouse floor. It felt like it was staring back at me, though I couldn't see its face. I kept waiting for my eyes to adjust to the darkness, but deep down, I knew something wasn't right. This wasn't my dad. Panic kicked in. I bolted to the treehouse window and screamed, "Dad!" as loud as I could, over and over. A light flicked on in my parents' bedroom, and within moments, I heard frantic footsteps retreating down the ladder. The back door flew open, and my parents burst outside, their faces full of alarm. My dad swore up and down that he wasn't out there and wasn't playing some kind of prank on me. The strange thing is, they believed me. This wasn't like one of those horror movies where the parents brush off the kid's story. My dad knew something was off. He called my uncle, who was an active cop at the time, to get his advice. My uncle filed an official report the next day, but there wasn't much for the police to go on. All I could say was that I heard a deep man's voice, saw the outline of a head, and knew he had called me by name. Beyond that, there was no evidence. Needless to say, I never spent another night in that treehouse again. For a while, my dad suspected it might have been one of the neighbors across the street. He watched them closely for months, but he could never prove anything. Whenever the neighbor waved or said hi to me, I tried to think back to the voice from that night. But no matter how hard I tried, I couldn't remember it clearly enough to say for sure. Even years later, it still haunts me, a lingering mystery that I can't shake, no matter how much time passes.